Few figures in modern history have cast a shadow as chilling as Pol Pot, a leader whose vision for Cambodia would transform it into a scene of unparalleled suffering. Over the span of 4 brutal years, he turned his homeland into a killing field. Under the Khmer Rouge regime, an estimated 2 million Cambodians lost their lives, nearly a quarter of the population. Families were uprooted, cities emptied, and entire communities erased. Today, we uncover the story of the man at the center of it all, Pol Pot, and the ideology that led to one of the most devastating genocides of the 20th century. In 1975, Cambodia's capital, Phnom Penh, fell into the hands of the Khmer Rouge. It marked the beginning of what Pol Pot called Year Zero, a radical attempt to create a society free of modern influences. What followed was a systematic dismantling of the nation, its culture, economy, and people. This is the story of Pol Pot, the Khmer Rouge, and the devastation they brought to Cambodia, a story of power, ideology, and the cost of human life. In the mid-20th century, Cambodia was a nation in transition. Emerging from nearly a century of French colonial rule, the country declared its independence in 1953 under King Norodom Sihanouk. For years, it enjoyed relative stability as Sihanouk pursued a policy of neutrality during the early stages of the Cold War, but by the 1960s, this fragile peace began to unravel. Political tensions grew as corruption and authoritarian policies alienated many Cambodians. Meanwhile, Cambodia's position at the crossroads of Southeast Asia placed it dangerously close to the escalating conflict in Vietnam. The Vietnam War spilled over into Cambodia as both North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces used the country as a supply route along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. In response, the United States launched a secret bombing campaign that devastated Cambodian villages. Between 1969 and 1973, over 500,000 tons of bombs were dropped, further destabilizing an already fragile nation. Amid this chaos, discontent grew among Cambodia's rural population. The Khmer Rouge, a communist insurgency led by Saloth Sar, later known as Pol Pot, exploited this discontent. They promised to create a society free from foreign influence, corruption, and inequality. Their vision was a return to an agrarian utopia where all citizens would work as equals in the fields. Drawing support from disillusioned peasants, students, and leftist intellectuals, the Khmer Rouge grew from a small guerrilla movement to a formidable force. By the early 1970s, they had taken control of large swaths of the Cambodian countryside. The U.S. bombings and the instability in Cambodia created the perfect environment for the Khmer Rouge to thrive. They used the devastation caused by foreign powers as propaganda to win over the rural population, painting themselves as saviors of the nation. Saloth Sar, a name that would later become synonymous with terror, was born in 1925 into a farming family in Cambodia's Kampong Thom province. As a young man, he was sent to Paris on a scholarship to study radio technology. But it was in the French capital that his life would take a transformative turn. While in Paris, Saloth Sar was introduced to Marxist-Leninist ideology. Immersing himself in communist literature, he became part of a circle of Cambodian students who envisioned overthrowing colonialism and creating a new socialist state. However, his interpretation of Marxism would later become uniquely extreme, placing collectivization and agrarianism at its core. Upon returning to Cambodia in 1953, Saloth Sar joined the underground communist movement, which would eventually be known as the Communist Party of Kampuchea. By the early 1960s, he had risen to a position of power within the party and began to consolidate his vision for revolution. During the 1960s, The Khmer Rouge operated largely in Cambodia's remote jungles, where they recruited peasants and students disillusioned by the country's growing inequality. Under Saloth Sar's leadership, the movement grew in strength and numbers, laying the groundwork for a revolution. By 1975, Cambodia was in chaos. After years of civil war, the Khmer Rouge seized control of the capital Phnom Penh on April 17. Saloth Sar, now known as Pol Pot, declared the dawn of Year Zero. All institutions, traditions, and modern systems were to be eradicated. Cities were evacuated. Currency was abolished, and the foundations of Cambodia's new order were laid. Pol Pot envisioned a utopia where industrial society and capitalism were eliminated. In its place, a purely agrarian communist state would arise. But what followed was a nightmare beyond comprehension. When the Khmer Rouge seized Phnom Penh on April 17, 1975, it marked the beginning of what Pol Pot called Year Zero. Cities were emptied within days. Families were forced to leave their homes, carrying only what they could. Pol Pot's vision for Cambodia was one of total transformation, where the nation would return to its agricultural roots, untainted by modernity or foreign influence. The urban population was sent to rural labor camps where they worked grueling hours with minimal food. Pol Pot's policies called for the complete abolition of money, private property, and religion. Schools, hospitals, and factories were shut down. The regime sought to create a self-sufficient agrarian society, but this came at the expense of millions of lives. Under Pol Pot's leadership, collectivized farming became a cornerstone of Khmer Rouge ideology. Yet, these plans were poorly managed and brutally enforced. Starvation swept through the countryside as crops failed and rations dwindled. The regime viewed dissent, or even perceived disloyalty, as a direct threat to its survival. Pol Pot's paranoia grew as his power consolidated. Intellectuals, professionals, and even those who wore glasses, symbols of education, were labeled enemies of the state. Many were sent to Tul Sleng Prison, a former high school turned torture center. Of the approximately 17,000 people imprisoned there, only a handful survived. Throughout Cambodia, mass executions became routine. Prisoners and perceived dissenters were marched to killing fields, where they were executed and buried in shallow graves. It is estimated that nearly 2 million Cambodians, roughly a quarter of the population, died from starvation, disease, overwork, or execution. Pol Pot's vision was extreme in its simplicity. He sought to destroy the old Cambodia to build a new one, but this required complete control. Paranoia and ideological rigidity fueled purges within the Khmer Rouge itself. As Pol Pot feared betrayal even among his closest allies, Pol Pot's quest for an agrarian utopia left Cambodia in ruins. The very people he claimed to uplift became the victims of his ideology. Fear, starvation, and death became the grim reality for millions under his rule. In December 1978, after years of escalating border tensions and Khmer Rouge incursions into Vietnamese territory, Vietnam launched a full-scale invasion of Cambodia. By January 7, 1979, Vietnamese forces entered Phnom Penh, bringing an end to nearly 4 years of Khmer Rouge rule. The regime that had claimed the lives of nearly a quarter of Cambodia's population had collapsed, while the Vietnamese occupation liberated Cambodia from the Khmer Rouge. The scars of Pol Pot's regime remained. Millions of Cambodians had been displaced, families shattered, and trust eroded within communities. Pol Pot and his remaining loyalists fled into the jungles along the Thai-Cambodian border, where they launched a guerrilla insurgency that would last for nearly 2 decades. For years, Pol Pot and his forces operated from hidden bases waging a low-intensity conflict against the Vietnamese-backed Cambodian government. Despite the atrocities committed under his rule, Pol Pot remained elusive, avoiding capture and international prosecution. By the late 1990s, the Khmer Rouge's power had diminished significantly. In 1997, Pol Pot was arrested by his own comrades during an internal power struggle, but he would never face justice. On April 15, 1998, Pol Pot died of heart failure, reportedly in his jungle hideout. To this day, questions linger about the circumstances of his death and the full extent of his responsibility for the genocide. As Vietnam liberated Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge crumbled, but the scars left by Pol Pot's regime remain. The Cambodian people continue to reckon with this dark chapter in their history, striving to heal and rebuild. Pol Pot may have passed away, but the weight of his actions endures in the memories of those who lived through one of the 20th century's greatest tragedies. The legacy of Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge continues to cast a long shadow over Cambodia. The regime's policies devastated the population, leaving the nation profoundly scarred. By the time the Khmer Rouge fell, nearly 2 million people had perished through starvation, forced labor, execution, and disease. The impact of this tragedy extended beyond the lives lost. Entire families were torn apart and communities destroyed. Cambodia faced widespread poverty, with its infrastructure, education system, and agricultural economy reduced to rubble. For survivors, the psychological trauma endured long after the killing fields fell silent. Efforts to seek justice began decades later. In 2003, the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia were established to prosecute key figures responsible for the atrocities. These trials brought some measure of accountability, convicting leaders such as Kang Gwek Eve, known as Dutch, who oversaw the infamous Tuol Sleng prison, and Nguyen Chia, the Khmer Rouge's second-in-command. While the trials delivered some justice, they could not heal the wounds left by years of terror. Survivors still grapple with unanswered questions about the fate of their loved ones. For many Cambodians, the trauma is a living memory passed from one generation to the next. Today, Cambodia is a nation rebuilding itself, balancing its tragic past with hope for the future. Education, tourism, and community initiatives work to preserve the memory of what happened, ensuring that future generations learn from this dark chapter in history. Cambodia continues to rebuild, but the shadow of the Khmer Rouge lingers in its collective memory. The resilience of its people stands as a testament to their determination to heal and honor those who were lost, while striving to create a future free from the horrors of the past. Pol Pot's regime serves as a chilling reminder of how power and ideology can devastate a nation. The Khmer Rouge's vision, born of radical ideas and implemented with brutal precision, left Cambodia scarred in ways that words can scarcely describe. Yet, amid the darkness, there is a story of resilience, a story of a nation determined to rebuild, heal, and honor the memory of those it lost. History is more than a record of the past, it is a lesson for the future. Cambodia's journey reminds us of the importance of vigilance against extremism and the value of humanity's collective strength to rise from tragedy. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. If this story resonated with you, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more untold stories that shaped our world.